Welcome back to the show. This is Dr. Joe here with the Neuro Wellness Podcast, and today my guest is Dr. Tom Stangel. Thanks for joining me today, Dr. Tom.
I appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me on.
Of course. Now, Dr. Stangel, you are down in Chattanooga, Tennessee, correct?
Yeah, that's where my primary practice is.
Yeah, I love Chattanooga.
Yeah, it's a good place. Good place. I know you came up and visited once or twice, and it was a good visit. It's a neat place.
Yeah, absolutely. So today the topic of discussion, something that you're very passionate about and something that you're very learned on, is the prefrontal cortex in particular and cognition.
Correct.
Correct. So that sounds like a very heady topic, but Dr. Stangel he's an educator, so he is going to make it all make sense to our listeners, I think. So
yeah, we'll do our best for sure.
Before we jump too deeply into the topic, I always like to ask our guests, a little bit about themselves, why they got interested in the field of neurology, and particularly cognition in your case.
Right. It's a little bit of a short story, but, I was doing, general chiropractic before I did all of this stuff, and I had come across Professor Carrick, probably 25 years ago in Dallas, Texas. He was at a Parker function, and he was doing something on stage. I remember thinking, oh, that's interesting. I don't really understand what he's talking about, but someday I might like to do this, and fast forward, probably 4 or 5 years after that, I had moved to Chattanooga, and I got a flyer in the mail, and they were teaching classes down in Atlanta, and essentially I just went in, and it just clicked right away for me. And what that meant was it was Professor Klotzek, I believe, was talking about, literally making the connection between like an SI joint thing and maybe a contralateral median nerve problem. How does that happen, And so it just made sense. And the reason it made sense for me was just simply the fact that, before, I was pretty learned, and my focus was a lot on sports injury, that kind of thing. I read stuff, but I had those patients that either didn't get better, maybe even I made it worse. It's like I'm missing something here. And so that basically led me to the neurology thing, and I was like, okay, this makes more sense, and now I get something more I can work with and use it. So the cognition thing basically came around as a result of starting to apply neurology to a kind of a chiropractic paradigm. So what that means is you're performing a history and exam. So you're asking more questions, and more often than not, all these people, even if they came in with like a neck stiffness or a shoulder problem, invariably had like anxiety, more often than not, even depression, those types of things. And it seemed to be a barrier to getting these people better, and so as I studied it, I realized they're really parts of kind of the same systems, essentially. So I had to figure out a way to deal with that outside of, hey, go see a psychologist or something like that. If that was indicated, fine, but, can you deal with it from a brain perspective? And so anyways, so I started studying that, and so that obviously fostered the ability to understand cognition, the prefrontal system, and its integration with other areas. And eventually, from a practice point of view, it turned into also me seeing a lot of those types of problems as a primary issue. So I went from more physical things, which I still see, to cognitive impairment type problems, or, things that are behavioral or whatever, anxiety, depression, and anything in the spectrum of type of disorders. So it just was a passion that came around, and it's just a way to change the brain and the nervous system in ways that we do. And otherwise, we tend to come from a little bit more bottom up model, cerebellum or body to think, but you can also come from the top down, affect those things, and then help people who have those issues. And that's kind of the short story of how I got more to this prefrontal kind of cognitive level of study.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a fantastic journey. Our Dr. George here at the clinic has a very similar start, he got the flyer in the mail, and then
right.
He's like, what's this all about? And
sure. Yeah, no doubt.
Completely changed.
Yeah, I know that feeling. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think before we, for our listeners, I think we really have to define two big things when it comes to cognition and the prefrontal cortex, and that is, what is cognition truly, and what the heck is the prefrontal cortex, right?
Yeah, let's start with the cognition thing first. It's really more of a broader term. It really just, and if you read about it, it says it's it's knowing stuff, but that encompasses things like your memory, your working memory, your attention, your various executive functions, things that we as humans kind of use to work around the world. We can pre-adapt and know what's going to happen tomorrow. Your dog probably doesn't have as much of that capacity. So that leads to the prefrontal system. Cognition is really not just prefrontal, but it's more or less kind of like the hub of that activity, right? And so there's various areas within the prefrontal cortex that subserve to different things, but ultimately it comes together as one whole. So the prefrontal system, and I believe it was, Dr. Trester put something about that. It's almost like 1/3 of your brain. So the frontal lobes are really it implies this whole prefrontal system. And it's huge, and it's the most advanced part of the brain compared to other species for humans. And so that has come about and led to cognition, our ability to do more complex things. That's not just walking around and maybe finding food, but we're now walking around intelligently to the kitchen or to a restaurant with a friend, and we're deciding which types of foods we like and things like that. And so all these cognitive abilities have come out of that based upon that kind of development.
Well, it's interesting that you mention walking around. How has the fact that humans are bipedal, walking upright, how has that helped to develop the prefrontal cortex along our evolution?
Yeah, that's a pretty deep subject there, right? So but it is this. I mean, listen, you're just dealing with more gravitational stressors, right? So there's more information coming in through the joints and the spine and things like that drive it through lower systems, cerebellum on up. So as from a kind of an evolutionary perspective, and this is just studies I have on the prefrontal system, and I think probably the place that I've read most about this is with Richard Passingham. It's a book called Neurobiology, the Prefrontal Cortex. Anyways, the idea is as we're, lower beings in the past, as they were becoming more upright on 2 feet, and they did this because they were in trees and grasping for things, then it became the ability to move longer distances in groups that drove this. And so then you drive your cognitive capacity through a learning process that it then becomes segregated out into different parts of one side to the next and back and forth, areas back and forth. And so it just became a process of kind of evolutionary ability to do more things that turned into thinking and, adapting and things like that. And that's really where that comes from. So you got drive, but it's also changing behavior. And then the behavior became these more cognitive based issues.
And some areas of cognition that you had mentioned were, you said, what did you mention?
Working memory,
Yep.
attention, various executive functions, even inhibitions considered to be an executive function, so different aspects of what is part of that cognitive ensemble.
Right. So how in your clinic can you actually test for these things? How do I know if my working memory is working well, or if my attention is working well?
Or some specific tests for those types of things, that you can do, but largely initially it comes from the history of the patient, right? So for me, when I look at them, they come in, whatever sometimes they're just coming in maybe for dizziness or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to get through that kind of whole neuraxis to see if there is other factors involved. So invariably I have questions that I ask about them. Are you having problems with your memory? So when you come down with the memory, then you got to, just like dizziness, you got to break it down a little bit. Okay, what's memory mean? Is it an episode? Can you not remember doing something, or can you not remember like the details of those things? Those are parts of the same memory system, but they're different areas of the brain. And then when you look at like working memory, then it's, are you able to, keep up with things that are currently going on, and do you lose it? And just different questions like that outside of, more specific, testing otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of how least for me, I go about that. And I know they have those issues, and then I just kind of address them from there.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the biggest questions that I get asked when, we're discussing cognition in the clinic with a patient is, does this equate to IQ? So I think that's
Well, I
one.
mean, part of it does, but just a small part of it, right? I mean, it's a lot more than that, I mean, it's, you can be not IQ smart and still know why you're going to the store to buy something, or whatever, so IQ is one element of evaluation, but, they've talked about EQ in the past, but what you really want to think about is how does it relate to what you do as in your own context of everyday, moving around, doing stuff, going to work, going to school, or whatever, and how that serves your behavior for you. And IQ or intelligence is one of those things, but it's not the whole thing anymore.
Mm-hmm. Something that I think is unique to our profession, this functional neurology, is that we say that we change the brain.
Mm-hmm.
We change the way the brain is functioning. Is cognition something that we can change in our field?
Yes, I think so. I mean, because I've been doing it for a long time now, and in part right now I'm doing studies in a master's program to study this more, find evidence that those things are there. So there's evidence, one, that rehabilitation affects cognition, whether it's exercise or things like that. So not just functional neurology, it's becoming more looked at. So as an example, I'm doing some research on like spinal cord injury right now, and the element of cognition, or the way that the resilience of the person's ability to do things, is really germane to fixing everything else in the rehabilitation of spinal cord injury. So it's being attacked that way. You put in cognitive level types of the stuff, and there are studies that do that. So you fast forward that to what we do. And I always tell my patients, think of this kind of like as PT for the brain. We're affecting body systems, vestibular systems, oculomotor systems, and even at the cognitive level, you're changing brain. At least functionality. We tend to, the one that I think the criticisms when people look at this stuff is it's not an anatomical thing. It's like it's not. They didn't see a lesion here, and therefore how could you change it in the lesion, like replace the part? But we know there's plasticity now and functionality and networks that connect, and I don't think that's really a mystery anymore. So if you make changes, whether it is something that's direct to cognition, or you use another mechanism for using a kind of a model of connectivity, you can change the brain. And I don't think I think that's we do that all the time. I think that's normal.
Yeah, I agree. Obviously, cognition, especially mild cognitive impairment, you start looking at dementia, Alzheimer's. These are really scary things for the aging population. What are some ways that those people can really, maybe take steps now to ensure that they really prolong their cognition and maximize their cognition?
Yeah, I think that's multifactorial. I think you've got kind of gross things you can do in your life. You have also specific things you might do with people like us who understand the brain functionality better, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at those people, and I see quite a few of them, it really depends on the state they're in at that time, right? The earlier, the better, right? You can really, I think, help people than if it's a late stage problem with Alzheimer's or something like that. So with that comes, if you read, things like general exercise, like Tai Chi, or just exercising and getting moving and things like that. And then also doing general kind of brain things, I think are important for those people, even if haven't identified any more specific areas that are a problem. I think that people who are getting more advanced don't do those very well because they can't process, as a whole with the brain, as much as they did before, so then they may need this kind of help. We go in and you say, well, maybe there's more of a problem in the cerebellum on one side or the other, or the cortex, and it looks more frontal or more parietal or whatever. And then you can do the things that we do to, activate those areas, to start to bring them up at a level they can tolerate. and then, you know, compare that against obviously what they're experiencing, you know. And I think many of us have probably had people like that have look like they're maybe in these stages, and they can improve, they can even correct some of the real symptomatology they have in there. And sometimes it's too, you know, they're too far gone, or there are other cofactors that may be getting in the way. But I think between these kind of you know, more general level lifestyle things and being active and proactive, and then getting specific with therapies based on findings in a place like this or your place or someplace like that, I think is a good combination for helping people that are starting to become more, have more dementia or other kind of degenerative elements of their cognition.
Yeah, I agree. That was perfect.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't dived too deeply in the prefrontal cortex quite yet.
Yep.
So I know that there are multiple kind of sections of the prefrontal cortex. Can you break those down and why each individual segment is important?
Sure. First of all, when you read the literature a lot, and you know, there are a lot of areas. You have like dorsal lateral area, ventral medial, prefrontal areas, and things like that. So these things are being shown to have different effects on different functionalities of the brain, and I'll get a little more specific with that. But one thing about the prefrontal cortex in general, it's still probably the least well understood area. It's I refer to it as like the ultimate integrator. Everything eventually gets there. Just depends on how it gets there, what it's going to do. And when you look at the prefrontal system, it is pretty large, but it has different sections, and there are more gross sections that are associated with it. And so you have like your dorsal part of the cortex. You have the ventral part, the caudal part, which is the frontal eye fields area. Some people include that, some people don't. Then they're the medial and orbital areas. So really what you want to think about these areas is that they're all kind of integrating together to carry information forward that then can then turn into some sort of output. The output being motor, behavioral. Motor being, when I say motor, it's body movement, it's thoughts, emotions, you know, even eye motions. They're all kind of motor outputs, you know, effects on autonomic systems. So starting with like the medial and orbital systems, they're a little bit more older. They're more prominent, say, in lower beings, the ones that don't have the dorsal or ventral areas. But the medial area is very much kind of like the past comparator guy. He's looked at all of your experiences. He's connected to other areas that look at that, learning systems, memory systems. So he's giving value. There's value coming in that says, hey, I've seen this before, but I'm going to contribute this to the overall prefrontal output. The orbital system is similar, but he gets more external input. So he's a real high sensory integrator, but not sensory the way we think sensory, just coming in and it is what it is. It's where it identifies and says, okay, now I've got this kind of sensory stuff. I've seen it. I look at it. I'm going to talk to the medial guy. That's why you hear this kind of medial orbital kind of thing. And he gives value to what's going on to say, okay, am I going to have an output? So now you throw it up to the dorsal system, and we more often say dorsolateral, but this dorsal system kind of includes the dorsolateral. And the dorsal system is a lot about timing, order, sequence. He's highly integrated to the posterior parietal areas. And so he starts to give you the organization, but he's catching information from medial and orbital, and they're starting to put together a plan and a picture of what to do. The caudal area is more your like frontal eye fields. And again, that's not always included into the prefrontal system, but because it's an information gatherer, and it's probably our biggest information gatherer, we're looking around in space, some people include it. And so now you have information coming in that you can look at really in real time, and it's included, and then it's all kind of put up into the ventral system, and the ventral system is a little bit more coming forward. And this guy's job, he also takes in cues from the visual and kind of auditory areas, but he moderates the output now. So you've got this overall output of the prefrontal system that is taking all this information. It's saying, you know what, I've got all these cool little options, but I think this one's the better one. And that's going to be shot forward and integrated towards, premotor and primary motor output systems. And that's kind of how the prefrontal system works in regards to taking all those areas together. Because this system has become so advanced, and other areas that are even more advanced than that, it's developed the ability to pre-adapt. It's seen it, it rehearses scenarios, and it actually checks itself ongoing, so that as you come along, like we're having a discussion right now and I'm yapping about a bunch of stuff in the prefrontal cortex, but I didn't think about a lot of this before we went into it. I just reacting to your question, why does it come out as something that sounds good? Because we just have this advanced brain based on all these areas coming together. And then the last thing that's really, I think is really a unique kind of thing, is that ventral prefrontal area has the ability to enhance the sensory experience coming in and things that it sees as important based on all that information it's getting. And it can also inhibit it all the way down to even to the spinal cord regions, the stuff that isn't important. So then that way you can kind of turn up and down what's important in your environment. And that's why we can have a discussion like this now and me not respond to the cars that are going around and things like that out there. So that's kind of I hope that's helpful. It's trying to put a lot into one small package, but it's a good way to give an idea of how that system more or less works.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that mind over matter comes to mind there.
I would think so. Totally. I think fits in that package very well.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned earlier. I think classically people are trained frontal lobe movement as far as body motor movement, but you mentioned thoughts and emotions. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of research that correlates lesions or issues in certain areas of the prefrontal cortex along with neuropsychiatric issues. Mm-hmm. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, you're because you're in the area where you are creating thoughts, and I think a good way to go with this is kind of in the anxiety area of things a little bit. And the reason is that you get a lot of effects from say having anxiety that create a lot of other issues, like your heart racing, maybe your body gets tight, things like that. So in the past, it was thought like these cortical prefrontal areas, neocortical areas created all that. And in a way it does, but they're separate systems. And we kind of know that, but there's a gentleman, Joseph Ledoux, who's, are you familiar with him at all?
I'm not.
He's kind of the guy that did like most of the research on anxiety early on, and he worked with even more other neuropsych kind of patients. Anyways, so he's written a new book called Anxious, and it's just more about changing the semantics of it. And so what that means is that when you're in that more cortical base area and prefrontal area, you're probably going to end up with more of the neuropsychiatric type problems, but it may not necessarily give you other issues, that it is located in those areas. And that's probably why you see the more of the neuropsych type problems from those lesion areas, but knowing that it's connected to other areas. And that's kind of the point he was making, was the difference between the two. And although they're interconnected, they're still separate areas.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite examples of a patient, not my personal patient, but is Phineas Gage when it comes mm-hmm. to the prefrontal cortex. I think sure. everyone, when they learn about the brain, they hear the tale of Phineas Gage. But for those in the audience who may not be familiar with his name, he's got a pretty interesting story.
Sure. Yeah. Of course, he had I believe it was an iron bar.
Yeah, the railroad spike, I think.
Yeah. So, it went right up through his, lower face up through his prefrontal system, right? And it changed his whole, personality and everything like that. So, and there are some other stories like that out there too. Unfortunately, some bad stories with like lobotomies and all that kind of stuff. But, but essentially, it kind of proved the point there. But, if you also think about the route it went through, he may have had other areas that were affected, So when we look at these areas, you never want to say, hey, just prefrontal or whatever. It's all connected systems that, that there's probably more to the story.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah. So you talked about the prefrontal cortex as being like a neural integrator.
Yes.
Right? So that means that it affects and has interplay with a lot of other systems and determines outputs and whatnot. How does that interact? How does the prefrontal cortex interact with other systems of the brain?
Yeah. So just as examples, right? In this one, I like the integrator thing. Dr. Fuster, who is like the primary kind of father of the prefrontal cortex, he actually refers to it as like kind of the ultimate integrator, right? So just like we see other areas, and what that means for people who are not as knowing, a neural integrator indicates it takes areas taking multiple inputs to create some sort of an output. And so that happens in the prefrontal system, but it has output, and it has output to motor controls in different areas. And so one is just pure body, and it affects literally things like your posture, your ability to be upright. And that happens through integration of lower areas like in your brainstem, your pons, and those areas to help you maintain upright bipedal posture ability to move forward. Other areas, the cingulate system, for example, and the cingulate is a lot of times associated with like limbic type concomitants. But if you look at like a good part of the cingulate system, is that it is an error predictor. And so what that means is it's information, and almost everything is considered to be like an error, new and an error coming in. So even if you and I rehearse something 1,000 times, it has to be evaluated for new information so you can use it appropriately. So between the prefrontal system and your cingulate system, it has this ability to learn and predict the errors. And so people with things like who have overreactions to things in their environment, they get anxious or whatever. A lot of times it's that cingulate system is firing too much, and it can't work with the prefrontal system. So from a connectivity point of view, you can use the prefrontal system to start to essentially get the cingulate back down to its normal learning process. So you can use things like efferent copy to do that, and then do certain rehearsals around that. The posterior parietal system is a really big integrated to that area. So when you look at like that posterior parietal area, there's issues with that's where you do a lot of motion processing, right? Whether it's something moving in the environment, something relatively moving in the environment, and that's where you use that to move forward, and there's big integration from the prefrontal system to that area. So as an example, I have a case in here with a lady right now who's she had a fairly significant, I'm going to say sexual abuse issue when she was younger. And she has a very significant problem with her ability to process motion in the environment. So she's walking around in space where she can't get going. But if you just go in and say, activate that posterior parietal system, it wasn't really working for her because she was still dealing with some of the cognitive level stuff, the psychiatric stuff here. So we were doing a few things around that, but she really needed also some more like cognitive therapy to deal with that. So as she's gotten that better, we were able to get that posterior parietal system to work, and then reciprocally that helps the frontal lobe. So the idea is that there's a lot of connectivity to these systems from the prefrontal system, and it's not still all understood how that works. But you can, if you can get that working, and as a human get them up moving around with what looks like normal frontal function, it gives you an advantage in helping patients in other areas of their nervous system or neurophysiology.
Mm-hmm. And that's with that particular patient or other patients in her shoes, where she does have some kind of neuropsychiatric components to her care or her case. How important is it to co-manage with, maybe a neuropsych or another therapist?
It depends on the case, right?
Yeah.
It depends on the level of it. I see a lot of stuff that, listen, if I don't have to send them off to say, see a psych, or if they're not doing it themselves, can I help that? So here's how I delineate that in my office. I've got a lot of whiteboards and stuff. If I can draw it out on my whiteboard, and if I can figure out, hey, neurologically, the way I might work with that, then I still think it stays within the scope of my practice for the most part. But there are real problems psychiatrically or emotionally or whatever that need the professionals otherwise to help them out, whether it's a psychologist or some other therapy like that. So, I've had people who were suicidal and we did our thing and they were suicidal in a day, but that doesn't happen with everybody, right? They might need their stuff. But in this case, this lady really needs that and to because she's lost trust in human beings. She needed to find the right human being, doctor, psychologist, to help her get her work through some problems that is now helping us. So we even took a little time off and said, hey, you can't divide your attention that much between these things. I think this is more important. Go work those things out. She's come back in now and she's just like a different human being. And now I can go in and fix all the rest of it. And she's becoming a whole person again. So so the management just depends on the individual, and that takes a little bit of experience, and that experience just came along as I had studied this stuff. It's not too hard for me now at this point to recognize, hey, maybe you need to be going over there or here, or I think you need to do a little bit more of this, or maybe I think we can handle it here, but we'll watch it and as we bring it along. So that's kind of how you look at it. But there is definitely a need for other things if in different individuals.
Mm-hmm. And I think staying in this same topic, do you have any examples of when, care where you're really focusing on improving the stability of the prefrontal cortex, or maybe a patient comes in with anxiety and depression and you kind of localize, maybe this is one of the areas of complaint for that patient. Have you found that by addressing this issue in particular with your neuro rehab, that patients tend to get off of maybe their anxiety and depression medication, or maybe other types of medications?
Yeah, for sure. And so, obviously within the scope of my practice, I can't say, hey, don't come off of this, but their goal is a lot of times to listen. They don't want to be on. There's a lot of side effects, and to them, it's almost it's like, it defines them that they have to be on those things. So they have a motivation, which is half the battle right there to get it out. So that happens. And the way I tend to handle it in here is, listen, these medications are kind of like an X factor. Sometimes they don't make any difference at all. You can fix them, do stuff with them. Sometimes they become a big problem. But as the progression comes along, there's kind of a way in which things are working. You're getting them better, and then there's less of a need to maybe do those. And then we refer them back to the prescribing doctors to say, hey, how do you titrate down off this appropriately? That's their expertise, so that there's not effects, and some people are really gung ho. They're like, hey, I'm going to come off all this. I'm like, well, that's your choice. But, and I've seen people come off it, not have a problem. I've seen people come off it right away and go through the roof. And so that's kind of how I handle it. There's definitely a goal with that. And I would say, at least in this office, the vast majority are able to either get off them or reduce them a good bit, and do well. So that's one of the benefits of what we do, is that capacity to make that work. One caveat to that, when you look at how those drugs work and what we do and how it works, if you don't really have that frontal lobe capacity, they don't really work. That would mean you got to still have it. It's like taking like Ritalin for the kids or something like that. It has to be able to process that, that new neurotransmitter concentration to be able to do it in the first place. So it's a good, if you see where they're starting to respond to what you do, and they were already responding well to the medications, it's a good indicator that they're going to maybe be able to get better with your care and eventually be able to come off it as well.
And I know this isn't necessarily a pharmacological discussion, but obviously if somebody comes to you or me versus if somebody goes to maybe a medical doctor with who is more inclined to prescribe, what are kind of the fundamental, strategies behind maybe your or my treatment versus, the more traditional treatment?
One, we both have the same goal for the most part. You want them to get better, So that's one thing we have in common, is that deal. I would say that that the strategy that is conventional whether it's medication, it's just what the standard is. Most of these people don't even have an idea that there's this kind of therapy out there. Maybe they're amenable to them going for like cognitive behavioral therapy, but a lot of times it's just purely, hey, this is what you have, this is what we prescribe. So, and there's usually some short-term benefits from those, right? Because you have changed it, whatever, but then eventually it doesn't work, or it starts to not work as well. So they're always changing the prescription or the dosages of the prescription, indicating that this guy is just not working for them over the long haul. So the difference is when we fix this, if this isn't ablated or pathological, or so plastic, meaning learn whatever it is going on that's creating, whether it's anxiety, depression, or other things, then you have an opportunity to go in and say, if I can activate this area, work it like a muscle. And that's what I tell people all the time. When you look at this brain system, it's not like a muscle. If it isn't working right, you just have to work it to get it to work. And that's not like, it's basic kind of physiology stuff. You work it, you create activity, proteins get built, you create energy through little mini genetic, processes. And essentially, if you can do that and do that right, there's an opportunity to fix it, so you don't have the necessity to have to use I'm going to say the false, but the kind of the passive way of changing it, which is the medications, right? So, the idea is if you can get that working, you can then create the machinery that takes away the necessity for the passive support, and that's the way I would say you would want to look at this, but it does take a definite knowledge of these types of things. You can go in and maybe if you're a balance specialist or something, you can definitely affect it. The balance system for me have to be in there, but the thing is there's more work to be done after that. And so you need to have a little bit better working knowledge of how does that cognitive system work? Because there's ways to kind of start to target and focus on those areas therapeutically from our point of view, so that it becomes more effective for them in changing that brain connectivity, activity, the networking of the brain.
Mm-hmm. If a patient is concerned with their particular level of cognition, I suppose what would be some of the red flags that you would notice, or maybe suggest that a patient seek your type of care? What are some of those red flags?
Well, I think one of the first things that happens, probably two of the first things that happens with people when they're having a problem for whatever reasons. One is probably their memory. They start losing some memory issues, and that's obviously associated with things like Alzheimer's or other stuff. So they get real concerned about that, especially if they have a family history of those things, Mm-hmm. So that can take many forms. They are telling you, listen, I don't remember where my keys are at. I don't even remember talking to my husband on Saturday. They're usually more short-term memory things, but it depends on what it is. It'll kind of tell you where in those systems it is, whether it's a semantic thing, an episodic thing, a more working memory-based issue. So that's one issue. Changes in emotionality start to come into play. And so more often than not, even though depression's a big thing, I think anxiety is a bigger thing, because I think we're wired to, when systems fail, like in our cognitive systems, we tend to go into more of a hyperkinetic area. And that means that too many thoughts, too many emotions, whatever. And essentially they'll start to have more anxieties about things, but that then turns more into depression because they're having such a problem with it, and so those are your kind of initial indicators of those issues. They become just less, or their affect becomes flatter, and that they may not notice that. Maybe their wife, spouse, significant other starts to notice those things. And I think those areas are where you see stuff more often initially when they're starting to change. And certainly the quicker you get to those problems, the better, whatever it is. I mean, you can have that just because you're off balance, but you could also truly have it because of a neurodegenerative disorder that is later on in life, maybe life-threatening. So the earlier the better to me.
Is there a certain age that you would recommend that somebody continually get their cognition assessed?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at, from my studies here, there are indications that probably you're thinking when they're starting to get towards their 50s, but there are examples in things like people with, like I said, the spinal cord injuries, other developmental things, that even in their 30s, they're having a problem. So I think, you know, if you're probably in your 20s or 30s in general, it's probably not such an issue. But hey, even if you're starting to lose your keys when you're not nearly as sharp at 7 as you were at 17, why not, right? Because who knows what the predisposing factor to neurodegeneration might be. You know, maybe it's just the fact that you've lost something because you were, you know, you were pretty vibrant at 32, and you push that problem a little harder, and maybe it induces, you know, the stuff that turns into cellular death or whatever. So I think cognition, you're a human being. It's different than the beasts of the fields. You know, you're not walking around sniffing stuff all the time, and it is really a human kind of a expression. And if it's not working well for you, I think any age maybe you might want to look at it, just so that your human ability to handle that is better. Because you don't know what that's going to do to you down the line. There's no question that when you lose these cognitive systems down the road, things like your cardiovascular system might be affected. I have a patient here like that, an enormous amount of stress. He had no cardiovascular issues, and he ended up with a heart attack. And the thing was, he had an old brain injury, but he was under an enormously stressful situation that led to him having 2 heart attacks and then a stroke. But but his cardiovascular assessments were all normal. And the only reason he probably had those was the change in those systems. And there's definitely indicators that can be affected by those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dr. Stangel, we are just about out of time.
Wow,
I wanted
fast,
to
doesn't it?
yeah, it flies. I wanted to make sure, though, that I leave some time at the end to make sure you can share with us any final thoughts that we may not have touched on during the episode.
Yeah, I think the final thought is this: is that in looking at neurorehabilitation or neuroscience, it's come a long ways, and it's getting more advanced all the time. And certainly these areas of cognition are now being looked at closer, but they weren't looked at as close in the past. You know, certain areas were looked at more. And so just as we look at in our particular group of kind of neuroscience practitioners, and you look around at, you know, maybe you've learned a lot about oculomotor function and vestibular function and stuff like that, and you might affect those systems to affect another issue. So say you do that, and next thing they go, their brain fog clears up. You know, you might have only done this because they told you they're dizzy, but they report back to you there's a problem. So you know there's some sort of connectivity there. When you think about prefrontal systems, and when I say that, that's connected to a whole lot of other stuff. It's just a hub around this cognitive area, but it has influence over a lot of other stuff. And so you can think of that just like you're thinking of the cerebellum, the vestibular of it as a system that can be not only a problem if it breaks, so to speak, or not doesn't work right, but also as a conduit to maybe changing other areas and using that as its own ability to be a therapeutic modality to change body physiology in other ways, you know. And I think the more we learn about it, the better we'll understand how to use it, and then it adds to your arsenal of the things that you're doing to try to change your patients. And I think that's the thing. And along with that comes the understanding of cognition, of executive function, thoughts, being a human moving forward. But it serves another purpose, and that purpose is the ability to say, okay, if I can do this better, does it help something else that I need to help in that patient?
I think this topic itself is something that might be a little foreign to most people, but I think you did a very good job today so far of just breaking down all the components of it. And I think that for those who are familiar and unfamiliar with the prefrontal cortex and cognition and the relationship, I think everybody's going to come away with a lot of good information after listening to this episode.
Well, I hope so, and that was kind of my goal, you know. And there's a lot to learn. So whoever has interest, they can contact me. You can give them my information or whatever, and I can help them out with that, you know. But it's you know, like anything, it requires a lot more understanding. But hopefully, we're able to kind of summarize at least a bit of what that prefrontal cognitive element is and why it's clinically important.
Yeah, which is, of course, our last question. If anyone wanted to get in touch with you or your clinic, maybe they have issues with cognition or other neurological issues that you manage, how would they best do that?
They can probably best do it through our website, which is neurochat.com. So it's NEUROCHATT with two T's, like Chattanooga. So neurochat.com. And that contains all our other stuff. So there's a way to contact me directly with email and even my phone number if there's like a text or whatever that needs to be sent. I'm pretty open to working with people that way to try to, you just answer questions. That's the idea, because it is an area they need to understand. Well, is this really what do I need to do? So we can kind of usually help them with that.
Yeah, and I can say firsthand, you've got a fantastic clinic down there in Chattanooga.
I appreciate it.
Yep. Well, Dr. Stangel, it's been a pleasure. Always love getting to talk with you.
Sure. Great. It's awesome, Joe. Appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate you being on. So from your host at the Neuro Wellness Podcast, be well.